Since Cyril of Alexandria was raised up at a time when things could have gone either way, we forget how this took a long time to sort out. We also forget that actually in the East, the dialogue was far more advanced than in the West in the initial stages. There were great thinkers at work, and they had already developed a vocabulary to handle the issues, which caused a problem when it came then to transposing these to Latin terms. Each term has to be precise, hence the correct translation of the creed that we have on a Sunday with words like consubstantial in it are important. We forget that in Greek, if one changes the smallest letter in the alphabet in one phrase which comes through to us as consubstantial, it changes everything. And that is what was happening for a while. There were some called the semi-Arians who wanted to put on this homoiousios, of similar substance, and not homoousios, the same substance. And that school was very dangerous. It was supported by the civil authorities, and that is what always made the Eastern Bloc a little bit weaker than Rome. The close link between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the powers up there in the Eastern Empire were always a menace. And actually we see the consequences of that close relationship even to this day in one specific area. It's the way in which in the Eastern Church they do, out of what they call economia, allow 1 second union in church before a priest for a marriage which has broken down. That comes from the early centuries when there was pressure from civil authorities to make certain important marriages work. We know how in the West the equivalent caused huge problems. Not far from here, Henry VIII. Rome would not budge on that issue, and we lost the whole of England in practice over what was one man's problem. So that's just a little parenthesis to be aware that freedom from too close a collaboration with civil authorities can be a blessing in disguise. With regard to correct knowledge, it comes from correct theology and correct teaching given by those who are responsible for feeding the flock. In our day, if one scratches, one will find massive ignorance. We know in Ireland that the question is partly linked with the fact that still, massively, the faith is handed on officially in the classroom. So it depends a lot on the faith or otherwise of the teacher at primary level. Now, that's going to have consequences for a whole nation if it is actually fairly weak. One cannot hand on what one doesn't really personally possess in a living, dynamic way. And so we have increasingly a situation where, for instance, when it comes to the encounter between heaven and earth in our churches, there is weak faith. And I was reading recently how weak faith, weak theology actually impacts on the liturgy. If we have a situation where massively, in practice, people are unaware even of the full implications of our theology, that we're handling heaven here in our churches, the Son of God, the Incarnation, the redemption, another world, essentially, if that is weak, then our liturgy also is going to be weak in its power. I mean, in the way in which we handle our God. We will find coming in more and more handling God as though we were there to encounter and meet ourselves, and also, as it happens, to get God officially honoured. But it will become more and more a free-for-all, because we will not be aware of the way in which actually we are supposed to be eclipsed before something far greater than we can imagine. If we're not aware anymore of the power of a God who is actually completely there, God and man, with all the mystery of the heavenly court, then the consequences are bound to follow. And one doesn't see then how incongruous it is to have jokes in church, clapping in church, and loud talking in church before and after. It will be very, very human. I just want to make one jump. It's the way in which the understanding of certain things does actually impact. Because I come from a country where there is much division, in Wales we were plagued by a very large amount of multiplication of Christian causes. One went to a village and one would find several chapels, all different. It wasn't the best. Now there's been a levelling out, because issues aren't as important as they used to be. But one does see that it does matter what actually one believes. And also, there is one profound difference between the Protestant mentality and the true Catholic mentality with regard to faith. It's this. It's, in practice, the way in which, in the depth of a Protestant mind, this is the operative mode. I accept this and this and this. The Catholic approach is, I am not in any way in a situation to choose. I just believe and assent to what is there. I am not creating my faith, I am on the receiving end. Why? Because I have a gift of light which is quite different. I am not finding my faith, I am seeing it. I am being taught it by an ongoing organ. The magisterium is Vox Christi. And by the way, in the early centuries, that was perceived even in the East. If one looks carefully at the early councils, always coming through discreetly, but always there, is the way in which they would tend to say, even if the Pope, the Patriarch of the West, wasn't there, but only there by delegation, by sending 2 delegates or whatever, with his written version, when actually that happened, they would tend to back down and say, Rome has spoken. It was there, and Rome was always regarded somehow as a point of solidity. It was lost in the East when they broke away from the Patriarch of the West in 1054, and they're trying now to have a Pan-Orthodox synod comparable to the Second Vatican Council, but they're having a great job to do so because of the principle of the autocephalous church. Auto and kephalos is head. Each church has its head, its patriarch, and they're very nationalistic, and it's very difficult to get them to do something in that way together. Therefore, one sees how, although they would not say so in public or admit it, they do actually secretly admire the way in which we, when we're going around the whole world, go into any Catholic church and don't ask, what country does this belong to? It doesn't enter into the equation. Is it Catholic or not? They know that that's a huge advantage, because when they go into an Orthodox situation, they go into a national church, which is very much aware of its language and culture and hierarchy. It's not, therefore, quite so simple. Therefore, we understand how the West is far more able to be open also to adaptability to a culture and to renewal. The B side is that it's also more open to hijacking, which is not the case in the East, because precisely if the faith is weak, man can take over. I just finish. We have to go to the sources to get our correct understanding of theology, and that can only mean reading. There is no shortcut. Reading or now listening to good teaching recorded. One has to be careful what one takes in. It's rather like food. One can get food poisoning by being exposed to the wrong stuff. So it's important that we select what comes into us and know also how to handle source material, going to the documents which authoritatively speak in the name of Christ. Right now we have the Catechism, the documents of the Second Vatican Council, we have canon law actually, and knowing how to manipulate the sources well. The magisterium is the only safe place. Other stuff has to be interpretative, but people must not depend on the interpretation. I conclude, we ask the Lord to give us that knowledge of things which comes from the Holy Spirit, for the gift of knowledge is genuinely a gift of the Spirit, and we need to have the vision of things which is not at all human, but to see the truth is thus, I stand back in awe, it is thus, and I have no power over it. Good afternoon. Do you live in this holy house?
You're stupendous.
I beg your pardon?
Remember, I love you.
What?